This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin Core's Inscriptions funny business. I think one of the best ways to understand the current spam wars is to view them in the context of Bitcoin's cultural history. We've already discussed how Bitcoin culture has always been anti-spam, using the example of the 2014 op return wars. And I'll put a link to this video in which I discuss that. I'll put this in the description notes below. But today I want to talk about how some Bitcoin Core devs apparently colluded in 2024 to help to weaken Bitcoin's code and make it less spam resistant. Now, this was obviously a horrific thing to do, especially when you're supposed to be stewards of the network. And if you agree with my analysis of what happened here, you will understand why I think that every single person involved in this cover-up needs to be permanently banned from working on Bitcoin Core. One of the reasons that we are having this crisis in 2025 is that those same devs were not removed years ago like they should have been, and as a result, they're still causing huge problems for people like you and me who simply want to use Bitcoin as money. So what exactly happened? The first thing that happened on November 14th, 2021, Taproot, the Taproot soft fork, the Taproot upgrade, if you want to call it that, was activated at block height 709,632. And then just over a year later, Casey Rodamore was able to figure out how to do the Inscriptions hack. And this is his tweet from January 20th, 2023. Inscriptions are finally ready for Bitcoin mainnet. Inscriptions are like NFTs, but are true digital artifacts, decentralized, immutable, always on chain, and native to Bitcoin. So this was the beginning of the Inscriptions hack. Inscriptions are a way of forcing the Bitcoin protocol to do something that it was never designed to do, namely to relay around large amounts of non-monetary garbage that looks like this. Inscriptions are a hack. They're an exploit of the Bitcoin protocol. They were never introduced deliberately as a place to store non-monetary data like op return was in 2014. Inscriptions are only possible today because Bitcoin Core devs introduced a bug into the code as part of the Taproot soft fork and then never fixed that bug. Casey Rodamore, as we said, discovered this bug, but instead of responsibly reporting it to Core, he exploited it like the attention whore that he is. Casey was helped by David Bailey's Media Circus, who gave Casey and the Taproot Wizards lots of media attention at Bitcoin Magazine and all of the Bitcoin conferences. And then David Bailey, along with Jameson Lopp, invested in Taproot Wizards and other spam companies, giving them funding to help them to spam Bitcoin, spam which will live forever on the blockchain, spam that even some poor Guatemalan family will have to download and process in 2078 when they decide to run a Bitcoin node to protect their family. That's how selfish and high time preference these people are, people like Rodamore and Bailey and Lopp. If you're finding this video interesting so far, I just pause really briefly here to ask you to help to support the channel. Hit the subscribe button, that does really help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for your future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. So what did Bitcoin Core devs do when this huge flood of new spam arrived on the scene? They did something actually worse than nothing. They in fact changed the definition of spam in an attempt to grandfather in the Inscriptions exploit. Here's what happened. Luke Dashjr submitted a PR, a pull request, to Bitcoin Core that would have made it easy for Bitcoin nodes to filter out this inscription spam and prevent nodes from relaying it to each other, and thus help to prevent it from getting into a block. So this was the PR that was opened on January 5th of 2024, and it's called Witness Scripts Being Abused to Bypass Data Carrier Limit. Luke explains the data carrier size policy option is meant to limit the size of extra data allowed in transactions for relaying and mining. Since the end of 2022, however, this is Casey Rodamore's hack, attackers have found a way to bypass this limit by obfuscating their spam inside of op-false, op-if patterns. Those are the two opcodes used for inscriptions. Obfuscating their spam inside of these patterns instead of using the standardized op return, which, as we've discussed, that was the place given for non-monetary data, this very small data field that people could use. This remains under active exploitation, namely the Inscriptions hack does, to a degree very harmful to Bitcoin today, even today. And then what happened, this PR was rejected. Here we have Gloria writing, history of this config option suggests data carrier size is meant to limit the size of data in op return outputs. So this statement is untrue. The statement where Luke says the data carrier policy option is meant to limit the size of extra data allowed in transactions for relaying and mining. Only Luke here understands the context. He understands the history, but there's something even more sinister going on, as this Stacker News article reports. And it really was Ghost of Unhosted Marcellus who figured this out, and that's who's posting it here. He writes, this is from February 27th, 2024. There's something very fishy going on in Bitcoin Core indeed. I have another anecdote involving Anthony Towns and several other developers and maintainers. In version 26.0, Marco Falco saw fit to redefine the description of the data carrier size config option from the old version, which was, quote, maximum size of data in data carrier transactions we relay and mine, to, and this is the new definition, quote, relay and mine transactions whose data carrying raw script pub key is of this size or less. Script pub key, I believe, is just nerd speak for transaction outputs. They changed this definition, and then what happened? AJ Towns and InstaGibbs Act, in other words, approved the redefinition, and there's a link here. I'll put all this in the description notes below. This was around the same time that Luke Dashjr was proposing to extend the applicability of data carrier to also catch inscriptions. That is what we're seeing here in this PR. Then Gloria and Ava, Bitcoin Core maintainers with commit access, in other words, they have write access to the code, they use that new meaning of data carrier size, this one, which only has to do with transaction outputs, to say that this was not applicable to inscriptions, which is a hack that involves putting the data in the inputs. This is around the same time Luke was proposing this patch. Gloria and Ava used that new meaning of data carrier size as an argument to reject the fix. And then Ghost of Unhosted Marcellus goes on to say, for non-autists, inscriptions store the data in the input section of transactions, while script pub key means output. So they narrowed the applicability of data carrier size in its description text. This was the change that they made. As Ghost goes on to write, this is particularly infuriating since Luke is also the developer who originally contributed the data carrier and data carrier size config options to Bitcoin Core back in 2014. They redefined, current Bitcoin Core devs, they redefined the meaning of his contribution in his face to be able to reject his new work more comfortably. And here's an example of the code if you want to take a look at it. Ghost writing here, now that people are starting to pay attention, it's probably a good time to remember that 2 years ago, Bitcoin Core officially fixed the inscription exploit by redefining the meaning of data carrier size. They seem to hate data carrier size for some reason. And again, that's the one that applies to Operaturn today. And it should apply to inscriptions if they hadn't changed the definition. For non-technical plebs, Bitcoin Core version 26 vandalized the description, data carrier size, so that it leaves out the spam instead of fixing the bug. And here are the people involved. As we said, Marco Falco made the change. AJ Towns, InstaGibbs, Fanquake merged it, and then Ava Chow defends the change. I like this analogy that someone made. This is from what WTF happened in February 2023.com. This is an example of how Bitcoin Core, if they were a doctor, how they work. Your x-ray showed a broken rib, but we fixed it with Photoshop. I think that's a good analogy. Now, if Bitcoin Core devs had listened to Luke in early 2024, we would have been able to avoid most of the inscription spam disaster. But because they did not listen, and because crypto VCs like Jameson Lopp and David Bailey helped to fund the spam attack on Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain is now permanently burdened with inscription spam that will remain there for the next 1,000 years and beyond. The UTXO set remains completely blown out, making it more difficult for new and old node runners who need to hold this UTX set and cannot prune it. They need to hold it in RAM. And if we take a look here, this is the number of UTXOs, the number of transaction outputs where the Bitcoin can still be spent. And this is something we want to keep as small as possible while still allowing people to use Bitcoin. But we can see right here, this was where the inscriptions hack was made public, really the spring and summer of 2023, and we can see how the slope of the growth of UTXOs really changes at that point and goes almost completely vertical. It's fortunately come down a little bit since then. There's been some consolidation of UTXOs, but this is the complete disaster where the UTXO set basically doubled, or a little bit more than doubled. As Ghost writes in this post, inscriptions are stored in inputs, but they create dust outputs. Since February 2023, the UTXO set tripled in size. Pay to Taproot, P2TR became the most common output. 89% of pay to Taproot outputs hold dust. Think about that. There's this new upgrade, this new type of Bitcoin address, and now thanks to Bitcoin Core devs' incompetence, 89% basically 90% of those outputs are dust outputs. They're too small. They're smaller than the transaction fees needed to spend them. 62% of all the dust outputs is in Taproot outputs. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. So this has been a complete disaster, and this gives the context for blowing open app return. They already messed up this filter here. They changed the definition of data carrier size, and now they're trying to completely blow data carrier size open to 100,000 bytes from just 80 bytes. So when Bitcoin Core devs tell you today that we need to open up op return filters, blow them open, because otherwise the UTXO set will bloat, which we were just looking at here, you should ask them why they did absolutely nothing to work to stop the UTXO bloat from the Inscriptions exploit, if this is something they were so worried about, UTXO bloat. But instead, what do? They attack the people like Luke who are seeking to fix it in 2023 and 2024. In summary, current Bitcoin Core devs presided over a quote-unquote upgrade, and it really remains to be decided whether Taproot was worth any of the things that came with it. Current Bitcoin Core devs presided over the Taproot upgrade, whose new address type is now 89% dust, as we said. And these people still have jobs. People still listen to them. It's like people in the fiat world still listening to the COVIDians and the Keynesians and the neocons after they've been wrong again and again and again and again. This is Bitcoin Core in 2025. But here's what's even worse. There's been no apology from Core devs. There's been zero reflection from Core. And then to add insult to injury, these same Bitcoin Core proponents of spam have been calling Luke Dashjr a scammer and an idiot and dragging his name through the mud, just because Luke and the Knots crowd have been trying to stop Bitcoin Core devs from further damaging the Bitcoin network by blowing out the op return filter in Bitcoin Core 30, which is going to be released soon. The good news, though, is if you're running Bitcoin Knots, you're helping to protect the Bitcoin network, not only protecting it from large op returns, but also protecting it from unconfirmed inscriptions, transactions, and making sure they don't get relayed around the network. If you want to learn how to run a Bitcoin Knots node for free, I'll put a link with all these resources in the description notes below, so be sure to check that out. You can run Bitcoin Knots on an old laptop, on your current laptop, on a desktop, or you can run it on a personal server that you connect to your router, and you can either build or buy this personal server. So I'll put a link to all these in the description notes below. If you want to be a sovereign Bitcoin node runner, this is the way to do it, to run Bitcoin Knots and have control over what gets filtered out. And this basically restores everything that should have been restored by Bitcoin Core devs after the Inscriptions exploit. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.